Thank you for joining us for this month's edition of African Liberty Webinar. My name again is Ibrahim Anoba, and I am the managing editor here at African Liberty. This month's webinar concerns inflation rates across the continent, the causes and the solution. I think almost everybody on the continent today in one way or the other affected by inflation. Before we came on live, I was looking at the inflation rates across the world. And in fact, African countries, or Africa itself, is the most affected or the most ranked in terms of inflation, which means we have more African countries in the top 100 than elsewhere across the world. And among the leading inflation inhibited countries across the continent are, of course, the usual suspect: Sudan, Zimbabwe, Ethiopia, and much more recently, countries like Nigeria are surging really heavily. So it's a big concern across the continent. However, just like many people, I'm not an economist, so I still struggle to understand how it affects my daily bread and other things. So that's why we have our guests today. And right now we do have Constantine Manda, who is the co-founder and director of the Impact Evaluation Lab at Tanzania's Economic and Social Research Foundation. He has over 10 years of experience working on expanding valuation in Tanzania and across Africa through capacity building, research, and policy engagement. Manda has won numerous awards, including the 30 most influential young economists of sub-Saharan Africa in 2022 by the Institute of Certified Chartered Economists. So it's a great pleasure to have you, Manda. And my colleagues that also be co-host with me, Chiamaka, Adinu, who is a fellow here at African Liberty. So let's just start off. Could you please explain why it's so hard to curb inflation on the continent?
So thank you so much, Ibrahim. Just as a way to kind of reiterate, so I work in an outfit called the Impact Evaluation Lab in Tanzania's Economic and Social Research Foundation, where we work around capacity building, research, and policy engagement on evaluating government and non-governmental interventions in development in Tanzania, and really in the East African region as well. So I think the question on how easy or difficult it is to curb inflation in the continent, I would have loved to have the other panelists join, because she is in many ways much more of a cookie cutter economist than I am. But I think what would be helpful for the discussion is to begin with first defining what economists think of as inflation, right? So in a kind of simple layman's term, the way to understand inflation is basically the phenomenon where you have much more money chasing fewer and fewer goods and services in the economy. So if there's a lot more growth in the money supply, much faster growth in the money supply, as you would in terms of output, in terms of all the stuff that an economy makes. So all the cars, every little output that your economy makes, in the case of, let's say, cashew nuts in Tanzania, as long as the money supply, as the Tanzanian shilling, is growing faster than the growth of those products, you're going to have inflationary pressures and prices are going to go up. One of the kind of most recent sources of inflation in Africa has been kind of two sources. One is the COVID-19 pandemic, which initially created concerns around liquidity. And so there was a lot of influx of credit and liquidity by multilateral aid agencies such as the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, multilateral agencies kind of in mitigating the worst adverse impacts of the pandemic in terms of economic impacts. But nevertheless, you had a situation where, because of this kind of excess liquidity that is in many cases in Tanzania, for instance, really starting to, being injected into the economy, you're going to have these inflationary pressures precisely because you put in a lot more money than the economy can cope in terms of matching that money with goods and services. The other kind of source of this inflation is being argued is from the conflict in Ukraine between Russia and Ukraine mostly, where you have a situation where agricultural products from the Ukraine and kind of other kind of downstream effects have increased energy prices, as well as kind of increased all the kind of costs that lead up to raising consumer prices. But just before I kind of answer your question head on, just to kind of finally say that it's not true that it's that the inflationary issue is bad throughout the continent. So South Africa, for example, has done a relatively excellent job of taming these upward pressures on prices. The Democratic Republic of Congo seems to be doing relatively well in terms of dealing with some of these issues. I mean, the worst cases obviously are Nigeria, Zimbabwe, and these other kind of economies that have kind of shown a lot of inflationary pressures recently, Ethiopia, among others. I think the way that these economies have responded, to answer your question, Ibrahim, on taming this inflation, is by raising interest rates. So, which is kind of fairly standard in macroeconomics, where precisely because people are having a lot more money to kind of buy fewer and fewer goods, the best way to kind of curb inflation is to dampen that demand. And how do you dampen that demand? You limit the ability for people to be able to easily borrow. So you raise interest rates to make borrowing very costly. That's going to kind of reduce a little bit of those inflationary pressures. The trade-off, unfortunately, is that if you are too aggressive, or if you overestimate the kind of inflationary pressures that you're trying to deal with, you could end up choking the economy and creating a recession. So this is what we see in the more kind of advanced economies. The US was worried about this, where they kind of raised interest rates too fast, too high. That created a situation that was kind of recessionary kind of pressures, where you now have a depression of incomes that could create a lot more problems as well. So that's the trade-off between kind of trying to deal with inflation and worrying about inducing a recession. And I will say that across several African countries, almost all the African countries have responded by raising these interest rates or kind of holding them constant, with the exception of Angola, which has relatively been kind of reducing those interest rates. And it's kind of an unorthodox way of dealing with it. And it'd be interesting to see over the next few years how Angola fares relative to her peers.
Right. So you did mention that countries like South Africa, at least on the continent, did some ABCs to curb inflation. The one thing I wonder is, African countries are not the only ones affected by the war in Ukraine and Russia. They are not the only one affected by COVID-19. But why is it that we still are the ones struggling the most or being affected the most? Why is that so hard to manage?
Well, I mean, there are several reasons, and I don't want to be definitive and say that I know or have confidence in adjudicating one reason and one potential explanation of another. I think we can kind of explore these in turn in no particular order. So I think the first critical aspect in thinking about, to what extent Africa is vulnerable to global economic trends is to think about the kind of commodity prices. So, the commodity prices is a kind of sector in the economy that is typically one where the supplier of those goods isn't going to be necessarily a price giver in the market. So they don't get to determine what prices they get to meet at the market. So they don't have a lot of market power. A lot of these commodities are going to be fluctuate. Their prices are going to fluctuate based on world markets, and there's very little this kind of African country economy can do to affect that. So one way to think about and relevant to African liberty in this sense is to think about to what extent coordinating these regional trade blocks could mitigate some of these issues, to be able to give a lot more market power to these commodity suppliers across Africa. So, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is a very important instrument in that direction, in trying to coordinate and make sure that Africans are negotiating, for instance, debt assistance together, so that they can have better terms. Because a lot of the problems with respect to inflation also have to do with debt service. So if it's very costly for you to service your debt, as the economy of Zambia is experiencing currently, you're going to have a lot more inflationary pressures, precisely because it has implications for the value of your currency relative to major currencies, and your ability to buy energy and kind of supply your economy with foreign currency to be able to make sure that investment is on track. And so one potential reason why Africans suffer the most, and I don't know if Chiamaka, I keep hearing my echo. Yeah, thank you. So I mean, one kind of potential way to understand why Africans are more vulnerable than other regions is precisely because Africans typically supply commodities, and these commodities, the prices of these commodities are really not a function of the abilities of these governments, of these African governments, to affect the price that they take in that market. And the one way to kind of deal with it, I think, in thinking about the kind of free trade emphasis in the world, is to exactly coordinate across these African countries to be able to have much more freer trade, so that Africans could have a lot more of their trade be intra-Africa trade, so that they become less susceptible to some of these other non-Africa global shocks, and could be able to kind of smooth those shocks more evenly across space, across Africa, rather than having particular countries be more vulnerable to experiencing this.
Right. So before I pass to my colleague Chiamaka, I see Ruki or Tieno raise their hand. But I'll just say, if you want to ask questions, you may please pose those questions in the chat box. And Marco Pondo says, I don't think Africa is vulnerable. The problem is those in power don't have an idea of what to do. Okay, now to more political questions. Chiamaka, please fire on.
To talk about keeping in mind Nigeria's upcoming election and the civil unrest, especially regarding the monetary policies. So, in what ways?
So you're muted, but we couldn't hear you very well, even when you were unmuted.
So Chiamaka, can I suggest you deactivate your camera and ask the question, then switch back on? Maybe that should help. Chiamaka, if you can deactivate your camera and ask the question, then switch back on. I think we're having a network problem there. Okay, try now.
So talking about the coordination and keeping in mind Nigeria's upcoming election and the civil unrest, especially regarding the monetary policies, in what ways do you think that the rising inflation is contributing to political instability across the African continent, and what can be done to further prevent this conflict and unrest?
Great.
Thank you, Chiamaka. So yes, there's a vibrant political economy literature on the political implications of economic shocks, and it seems a recurring feature in political campaigns, not just in the continent, but really across the world and really across time. The kind of infamous joke by the Bill Clinton campaign in the early 90s against George Bush Sr. So this is George Bush Jr.'s father in the early 90s. That the kind of the joke that in trying to criticize the Bush campaign, the Bill Clinton campaign had this kind of phrase saying, it's the economy, stupid. That the major issue that we're going to contest in that election was the economy. So I absolutely would not be surprised if there was definitive evidence showing that the economic crisis in Nigeria is going to be not only relevant for the political campaigning and election results, but matters in understanding how and who are the players in the current election. I think what's much harder to understand in a lot of these crises is how patient the Nigerian voter will be, depending on who wins the elections. And I say this because one of the ways to curb inflation, as I mentioned earlier, is to raise interest rates. So to make borrowing very, very difficult. The Nigerian government has already done that, right? And so it seems in a lot of these economies, especially in Nigeria and Zimbabwe, raising interest rates wasn't sufficient enough to the economy didn't respond as well as it should have. And so the question then remains, whoever is going to win the election has a huge mandate, but also in many ways a lot of expectations. And I'm not certain that the Nigerian public is aware that they need to give whoever wins and whoever starts to build that administration the benefit of the doubt, because the policy instruments available to them to mitigate some of these issues are going to be very restricted. They've already tried the kind of standard response, and perhaps maybe that response wasn't aggressive enough, right? But remember, the trade-off that they're dealing with is if you raise it too quickly, or too high very quickly, you might create a recessionary issue, which Nigeria's economy is a particularly pertinent trade-off to consider very carefully. So I hope that one of the things that I would urge my brothers and sisters from Nigeria is whoever wins the election, that we as Nigerians, in some sense, give that administration the benefit of the doubt and allow them to really make the right policy choices without necessarily having to have the kind of short-term concerns that voters will obviously have. The biggest problems in political leadership is kind of managing and balancing these kind of short-term concerns of voters, right? Voters need a job now. Voters need a scholarship to go to college and university now. With how the economy, an economy as large as Nigeria's, is like a huge oil tanker. You can't easily, it's not a speedboat that you can easily turn it around. And so understanding that and giving that administration the benefit of the doubt. Now, that does not mean that we should be complacent in our demands for good governance and good accountability, and to ensure that whatever debt that the economy is going to be taking on is debt that is going to be invested in the public sector to ensure higher returns, so that you're not just servicing debt for the sake of enriching the few in power in Nigeria. But nevertheless, I think we need to give the benefit of the doubt to whatever administration. Obviously I don't want to claim to have a side in that election. I'm not Nigerian, so it's but I'm excited at what I'm seeing, and I hope that Nigerians are equally excited about the kind of possibilities of the results.
I quite agree with the economy that
Chiamaka, we're having the same issue again, so let's try the same magic one more time.
So sorry about that. So I would say thank you for the answer, very concise answer. I liked how you mentioned how the economy is not something that you can just quickly revive. So I'm not talking about policies. I would like to, there is evolving discussion on how fiscal policies can lower inflation and establish an economic balance in the long term. So what are your thoughts on the use of such innovative approaches, including alternative monetary policies regional economic integration, and digital currencies to address inflation. So what are your thoughts on these alternative approaches?
Okay.
Sorry, Chiamaka, I couldn't hear you very well. But what are these alternative approaches?
Yes, there is evolving discussion on how fiscal policies can lower inflation and also establish an economic balance in the long term. So what are your thoughts on the use of such innovative approaches, including alternative monetary policies and regional economic integration, and of course the digital currencies to address inflation? How can they be used to address inflation?
Yeah, so I mean, I don't want to speak too much with respect to these kind of unorthodox economic policies. And maybe it could be a scholarly debate among economists. I think one kind of cautious tale is the issue in Turkey. So Turkey is facing incredibly high inflationary pressures. Now, the way it's being kind of its wager has been to actually lower interest rates. So it's a kind of contradictory move because if you already have high inflationary pressures, recall that means that you have a lot more money in the economy than you need. And so the way to do it is to try and reduce the amount of money that you have in the economy. And lowering interest rates is just going to increase the amount of money that is going to be, enter the economy through higher investments, because it's much cheaper for you to get a mortgage. It's much cheaper for you to get a loan, to buy capital equipment, to expand your factory, and so on. And they're banking on the idea that as long as income growth is faster than the growth in prices, that they'll be fine. That they won't have a situation where real income will then start to get affected. When you get to a point where real income start to get affected, you have the kind of hyperinflationary stories of the early 2000s in Zimbabwe, the kind of post World War II Germany, percentages, which in some cases still exist in the world. But that's the kind of cautionary tale, and the Turkish economy seems to be faring relatively well so far in that wager, but it's something definitely to look forward to, and it would really be a kind of very revolutionary insight in economics, where we can now have an empirical example where an economy did not respond to inflationary pressures by raising interest rates, but they rather lowered them, and they still fared out well in the end. The historic literature shows that it's better to raise interest rates, otherwise you have this kind of spiraling of inflation, and so it'll be curious to observe the situation in Turkey. Ibrahim and Chiamaka, if you will indulge me, there are two questions that folks have asked, and I wonder if I can respond.
Yes,
because I can't type. Yeah.
No, I was going to bring us to those two questions. So thank you, Chiamaka, for those brilliant questions. So the first is from Glorious Olajire, and they asked, these solutions seemed to focus on what financial institutions can do to curb inflation. What can I do as a citizen? Which was one of the questions I was going to ask anyway. So yeah, thanks for that question, Gloria. So what can citizens do to curb inflation from the bottom up?
Yes, so this is a great question by Glorious Olajire on this, and so the first kind of part of the answer is to say inflation is an economy-wide issue. And so it demands an economy-wide solution. And we should continue to demand economy or nationwide type of solutions, because there are a lot of efficiencies of scale that we could, a lot of economies of scale that we could exploit. That the kind of technical term in economics is as the bigger you are, you get to benefit from lower average costs, because you're so big, you can produce things at scale that will make it cheaper for you on average to produce the product. So one way to think about this is to say, well, as I let the government handle this, I, as a citizen, am going to first select the best political candidates that I think are really focusing on inflation and employment, right? So trying to reduce inflation so that real incomes remain positive, but also making sure, especially among the youth of Nigeria, for instance, and other African countries, which is a sizable majority in most African countries these days, to make sure that you vote for candidates that really focus on inflation and really focus on ensuring that real incomes of the poorest people in the countries is part of their policy agenda. I think the second thing you can do personally is to ensure that you prepare yourself to be able to manage the negative impacts of inflation on your own life. And of course, the easiest way to do this is to make sure that you have savings. Now, that's easier said than done. If you're young, you obviously don't have enough income flows to have accumulated savings and so on. And so this is why it's very important to ensure, particularly as young people, to start considering, especially if you're inheriting any assets or if there's any kind of assets that you can tap into, community as another source of smoothing one's consumption in a negative income shock. So these kind of community savings groups are very important in trying to help people access credit, affordable credit in ways that can smooth their consumption in the wake of negative income shocks.
Right. I just like the fact that you pointed out that it's not easy to save as Africans, more so young Africans, because you need the job, you need a good job to save. But yeah, savings is one of the things we always advocate. But we got another question yet again. This time from Merit Ayibe, and they ask: most African nations usually don't prepare way ahead of economic shocks, and when they attempt to solve these problems, they create more economic turbulence. Tell us, how best can African nations position themselves in order to respond to economic shocks effectively?
Yeah, so I mean, this is a difficult question, and so I don't want to claim to propose an answer. I think one way to think about it is to think about one of the most recent books, for example, by Stefan Durkheim, who's a professor at Oxford University, called Gambling on Development. So, and this is not anything new in some sense that Stefan is proposing. There's been literatures in political science and economics and elsewhere that have talked about the social contract between political leaders, elected officials in our countries, and the society in which they lead. And the social contract in many African countries is broken. And it is broken because, as Stefan argues in the book, the idea is you need to have an agreement between the people and the elites. Mm-hmm. So in particular in Nigeria, right, the Nigerian elite versus the greater Nigerian public, there needs to be an agreement that goes back to Munster Olson in the political economy literature on this idea of roving versus stationary bandits, right? So if you have a bandit who just comes and raids your village but doesn't live in your village, that's the worst case equilibrium, because they have no incentive to ensure that there's more stuff to steal next period, right? Because they go village to village. As long as all the villages in the vicinity always have enough recovery for them to keep pillaging, that's the worst outcome for the villages. Now, of course, if you have a stationary bandit who is a bandit, who is the kind of Nigerian elite who is stealing money from public funds, an elected official in Zambia who is signing debt contracts that he knows the economy is unlikely to be able to service, and overpricing infrastructure projects with that debt money, so that even the kind of bang for your buck, the kind of value for money that we're incurring with this debt is actually not there. So the stationary bandit idea is to say, hey, we need to have an agreement with the elites that says, fine, we know you guys want to pillage, so go ahead and pillage. But obviously, the pillaging that you're doing is inefficient. So there needs to be some kind of, bare minimum pillaging, and then everything above that, you guys got to deliver efficiently, right? So this is the kind of Tanzanian Magufuli, the former president Magufuli kind of philosophy that says, I understand people in government steal and, go ahead and steal, but I mean, at least build the road, right? Like build the road. If you're going to take your 10%, take your 10%, but don't take a full 50% or 100%. And so the idea there is to have an agreement with the elites that could provide situations that the elites can easily invest in public goods and services without worrying that the public will come back and seek redistribution. Because one of the biggest fears in these models, in these political economy models, trying to understand these behaviors, is that the elites are nervous, right? They're sitting in I don't know, Lekki phase 1, Lekki phase whatever. If I remember correctly, Lagos, that's one of the great neighborhoods, I think. They're worried that, they're sitting behind, very high walls with CCTV cameras and electric fences, because they know that the poor in Nigeria would need to, want to redistribute that wealth to themselves and, to everybody else. And so the way to kind of have a contract where it's equally beneficial for both sides, for the elites and the public, is what has been a big struggle for Africa. There has been, very important successes. So the elites in Botswana, for instance, I think do a much better job of implementing this contract. I think Kenya increasingly does a much better job at this enforcement of contract between the elites and the public. So I think one way to think about it, I'm sorry, I feel like it's a hand-waving kind of response, but if I knew the answer, I would have a Nobel Prize in economics. And so I could only kind of offer what the literature and what the kind of science on this says. And the science of this says is that the way to incentivize our leaders to act in our best interest is to tell them nobody's going to come and rob you in Lekki phase 1. Like, it's okay, keep your Land Cruisers, but just build us the roads, build us the schools, pay the teachers on time, pay the doctors on time, and we'll leave you alone.
Yeah, the only problem with that, and also with Magufuli, is that they advocate for that 10%, your own personal purse, but they take more than that. So we can't even give them an inch because they'll take a whole yard. So yeah, that's a fascinating philosophical conundrum on the continent. But we'll take 2 more questions and we'll round it off with those questions. And the first one we'll take, I don't know if you can kindly answer each question in 2 minutes. We'll take the first one.
Sure.
There's a comment from Susan Nganga. I hope I pronounced the name correctly. And they say African nations are trying to address economic inflations using post-colonial tactics. We have all the resources, yet we are still depending on our colonial masters. If we are able to set our own standards, perhaps we can be free from inflation. Good idea. George Temba says or asks that, what about the issue of parallel markets in relation to inflation in some African countries? What do you think about that in 2 minutes?
So in terms of this issue of parallel markets in relation to inflation in some African countries, I mean, this is an issue of formalization in the economy. And it goes back to this kind of original political contract between the elites and the public, because, one way to redistribute this income is through taxation. That's the fiscal instrument that we have in government to take money from the wealthy and redistribute it to the poor. Now, because the elites are hesitant to have their income and wealth taxed, you tend to have a situation in Africa where there's an over-reliance on sales taxes. Now, sales taxes are highly regressive taxes. And by highly regressive taxes, economists mean taxes that are more likely to affect people on the lower end of the income spectrum rather than the wealthier individuals at the higher end of the spectrum. Whereas, income taxes, especially those that discriminate between high income and low income individuals and taxes them accordingly, is a lot more fair in terms of the kind of political redistribution of incomes in a country. Now, because the elites have done so well, have been so successful at resisting that agenda, you have an over-reliance on sales taxes. So when you take a look at a lot of these fiscal budgets being tabled every June or whatever in our parliaments across Africa, you'll see a lot of reliance on sales taxes or different versions of sales taxes that keep getting added on every year. And because you don't get to see the cumulative change at once, before long, the regressiveness of this tax becomes, overwhelming. And so, one way to think about it is, to what extent can we fix that contract, one, and then secondly, to what extent can we ensure that the fiscal regimes are not going to be relying on sales taxes in the poorer, but do a much better job of identifying the high income taxpayers and making them comply, right? And so the kind of political economy structures with respect to taxpayer staff members who go and collect the taxes is important. The ideas to incentivize people to reduce tax evasion is going to be very important there as well.
I have an interesting question here from Judge. So, Judge asks, what about the issue of parallel markets in relation to inflation in some of the African countries?
Could you ask?
Sorry, I didn't. Yeah.
Okay. Could you ask that one more time?
Yeah, I think there was a question here by Jimmy Zozi.
Okay, so what we're gonna do is I'll just read out we got like some other questions. So let's I think we got like 4 or 5. So let's take each one with 1 minute, if very possible. So Jimmy Nzonzi asked, can you explain why Zambia has low inflation rate, but the general prices of goods and services are increasing every day? Then an answer to that?
So yes, I don't have the answer to that, unfortunately. And I used to live in Zambia, and so I apologize to my brothers and sisters in Zambia, Mulibwanji, but I do follow Zambian politics and Zambian affairs tangentially. So I think one kind of easy thing to say, which would be kind of, I think, a lazy thing to say, is to doubt the government statistics, right? To say, the government is releasing these inflation figures that show that inflation is relatively low, while at the same time you have experiencing higher food prices and so on. I think that's a kind of maybe part of the story is the kind of fudging of numbers, because governments try as much as possible to control the narrative around economic forecasting and economic issues, and so I suspect that may be part of the story, but certainly it isn't the full story, and I doubt that it's even an important part of the story. And I suspect Zambia is one of these countries that early on had fairly high human capital, had a lot of kind of developed mineral sectors, and so Zambia is something that I wouldn't discount, and I think I don't want to be political, but I'm a relatively big fan of the current administration, and I think that I have a good friend of mine who's a Zambian economist, Dr. Grieve Chelwa, who may disagree with me, but I think Zambia is going to be on the right path fairly soon. People like Grieve and others are doing an important job at pushing back at some of these unfavorable terms that these multilateral agencies are offering a country such as Zambia. The folks who hold Zambia's debt, private sector as well as public sector folks, I think it's going to be important for the Zambians to fight to make sure that they get a good deal in trying to get some of this debt forgiven, or some kind of a grace period in servicing this debt, to ensure the government has the fiscal capacity to maintain itself, to pay payroll, to ensure goods and public goods and services are provided to the Zambian citizen, while at the same time being able to service its debt obligations. But I'm very optimistic on Zambia. I'm obviously very biased, having grown up in Zambia and having an affection for the people in the country, but I suspect that they'll do much better than people predict.
I second your statement on that one. Edgar Lungu did a lot of interesting job, to say the least, and we hope Chiamaka can do a better job. So I think we're just going to take 2 more questions and we'll just call it off. So the next one should be from, I think I got a comment. Okay, it's a question by Judge Temba. They say, what about the issue of parallel markets? I think we already answered that one from Temba. Let's take this one from Tekaling Gidi. who asks, what do you think about debt and taxes? Rather.
So I'll focus more on debt, but before I start on debt, let me talk about taxes. I think taxes, the most important thing, and the impact evaluation lab at ESRF where I work, we have recently won a grant with the Swiss National Science Foundation to work with the Tanzania Revenue Authority, which is the tax collecting agency in Tanzania, to deal with inequality with respect to tax burdens. And so one way is to do this, for instance, is there's a lot of domestic workers, residential domestic workers. So I suspect this is true in many African countries, in Nigeria and Zambia, where you have a maid who lives with you, especially if you're kind of middle income or high income household in these countries. You'll have an individual who cleans the house, cooks the food, and they typically will be women. And a lot of these workers are not formal workers, even though they've been hired by government officials who know the rules of formalizing these workers, who knows that they need to adhere to human resource laws in the country, including, paying for overtime, because these people work overtime. I mean, you're working in that house for 24 hours. And so we're working with a union here to try and formalize and ensure that both the employer pays pension and health insurance and potentially taxes on that income as a way to encourage an increase in the wages of these individuals, of domestic workers. And also similarly on entrepreneurs in Tanzania, on a second experiment, we're trying to work with the revenue authorities to create exceptions for entrepreneurs and when they pay their taxes. In Tanzania, because the government doesn't do a good job of identifying and measuring someone's profitability, they don't have a good sense of what level of taxes to pay on these sales. And so the way the government deals with this is, they have particular thresholds in which they will, automatically ask you to pay for taxes ahead of your sales. Now, this is a very costly practice because, how do I pay for taxes on products, on sales that I haven't yet realized, right? Because, I already am liquidity constrained as a young entrepreneur. I don't have enough cash to even set up the business. I want to be formal. I don't want to be informal. I don't want to evade paying taxes, but it's just too costly for me to do so and operate my business. And so we're trying to ask the Revenue Authority to have a set of entrepreneurs be allowed to pay the taxes when the sales are realized, to see whether this will both improve tax compliance, but at the same time ensure profitability among especially young entrepreneurs. So these are kind of potential solutions that can be offered in terms of taxation to make it much fairer and to reduce the burden on the poorest households, because that's obviously going to be not very good for income inequalities in our countries. To respond to the issue of debt, so I was in a panel last year in Tanzania where we have, for those of you who don't know, the former President Magufuli passed away in March of 2021. So it's going to be almost 2 years since he passed away. The Vice President, Madam Samia Suluhu Hassan, who is now the president, assumed the presidency, and she has followed in a lot of the policy focus, including, for example, infrastructure investments. But there are other deviations as well, including, most importantly, on the COVID-19 policies. But nevertheless, in this panel, one of the complaints that you hear more increasingly in Tanzania is that Madam President is taking on too much debt as a percentage of the economy, as a percentage of GDP. We're taking on too much debt. And one of the things that I reminded folks then, and I would like to mention here, is that one, there isn't an economic theoretical consensus with respect to whether there is a debt limit to government debt. And the reason is when you think about it very simply, when you as an individual are borrowing, you have a limited life expectancy. You are not going to live forever. And so the bank knows this. And so if you go into a bank and you're 65 years old, they're going to give you a very high interest rate, or they're going to give you a loan that can only mature within 5 years. Like the kind of limit on its maturity is 5 years, because they don't expect you to live that much longer, right? If the life expectancy of a Nigerian woman is 68, 70 years old, and you come in at the bank at 65, on average, we expect you to die in the next 5 years. So we're not going to give you a loan beyond 2 years. And it's going to be a fairly high interest rate loan as well. So it's going to be very costly for you to get the loan. But if you're a young person in your mid-30s, you have a relatively good history of stable employment, yeah, we're going to give you 30 years of a mortgage at a very low interest rate because we know you're a much safer bet. You're unlikely to die anytime soon. Now, governments don't expect to die. So, although the political leaders of these governments will die, governments do not. So there isn't that same kind of time horizon that determines what the limit would be. So, for example, Japan, at some instance, and I don't know whether this is true, but certainly when I checked it last year, was the highest burdened country in the world, with almost 300% of its GDP being leveraged through debt. Now, the reason the Japanese and the Americans can almost borrow almost without limit is precisely because the people who are lending it to them know that whoever is in power in those governments will continue paying off this debt. They will never, ever default on this debt because they have good credit history with its creditors. So the way to think about debt is not to be too beholden to these percentages of GDP in criticizing the Zambian government, in criticizing the Nigerian government, because governments can have and change those contracts to just push them to a further time horizon, provided future administrations of Nigeria and Zambia and these other African countries will never default on this debt. The debt can be easily serviced. So I think one way to encourage our governments is to strengthen political institutions, to create and signal political stability, because that's going to make it much cheaper for them to borrow, and it's going to make it much cheaper for them to have much longer time horizons to be able to smooth that servicing of debt, so that it's not very painful for us to build these bridges and build these standard gauge railway projects, build hydroelectric dams and so on, that are very, very expensive things to do, that have returns spread out over a much longer time horizon. So you don't want to be borrowing at a shorter time horizon to be constructing something that has a much longer time horizon, which is one of the things that a lot of these countries are facing.
Right. Yeah, I totally agree with that. The problem is actually not with borrowing. It's what you are actually borrowing to do. Well, in case of many West African countries, at the least, they borrow to pay salaries. I don't know how that is sustainable. Some people, I think Zambia borrowed a lot of money to build stadiums. South Africa did the same. Many African countries, they just borrow the money to do nonsense. But as you said, countries like Japan and the US have huge debts, and still the debts of the long run, yield the returns, and they're able to service their debt without any hitch. We'll take one more question, and that is it. But before, we do have a couple of questions that we can't take because it's just we are limited time. So if you may kindly drop your Twitter handle, Constantine, just for folks to follow up with you, or your email if you're comfortable with it, so that I can send these questions to you directly. But we just take one of them and we move on. So this one is from Muyiwa Adekoje, who is a writing fellow at African Liberty, and he asks that what is the relationship between inflation and poverty in Africa? And how can policymakers ensure that efforts to control inflation do not harm the most vulnerable members of the society?
Yeah, I mean, inflation is very bad for incomes, precisely because it will go and eat your income, right? So if you made 5% more this year, in 2022 than you did in 2021, but inflation was 10%, you actually lost 5% of your income. And so, it's definitely something to think about in terms of poverty. And the best way to think about it is to really have independent central banks that whose sole focus is on monetary policy, and to have very little political interference in the central banks managing or stewardship of the economy. So to allow the technical economists in our macro units in the central banks to really do the best job that they can without the kind of political pressures of the kind of politics of 5-year terms and satisfying voters. So that's definitely intricately related to that. And the way to deal with it, as we know, is to kind of have these monetary policies that limit the amount of money supply growth relative to income growth, and to not be too optimistic about income projections, because if you're too optimistic about how much the economy will grow next year, and then you really start to tighten belts by raising interest rates in anticipation of higher income growth, you might have a situation where it's even worse for you. So that's definitely very, very important. I think I want to just mention one additional thing that's related to both how inflation matters for incomes and poverty, and what our economies and governments can do, is to what extent is this debt foreign or local debt? And there's dimensions within there as well. Is this debt denominated in your currency? Is another way to say it. Is this debt in the Zambian kwacha or the Nigerian naira, or is it in euros or in dollars? Because that kind of debt is the worst kind of debt. So if you were to think about a checklist of what's the worst things our governments could do, is echoing what Ibrahim and others have said, borrowing for paying salaries or borrowing to build luxury kind of what they call prestige projects, right? These are projects that make you feel great as a Nigerian because there's this fancy stadium and you're hosting the African Cup of Nations, but don't necessarily have positive economic or political impacts in doing those projects. So definitely that's the kind of really really easy thing to solve, but it's really, really bad. And then if you're borrowing to build a stadium for the sake of prestige, but you're borrowing from a European, that's even worse, because now you're not just beholden to local economic conditions, you're also beholden to currency markets globally, which you're not going to be, especially if you're not a big economy like Nigeria and South Africa, you don't have a huge effect on the Nigerian American dollar exchange rate, no matter how much even with a sizable Nigerian population in the diaspora, you're unlikely to move these prices that much. And so, that's the second order kind of problem, right? You're borrowing not for doing something that's productive and kind of give you positive returns to help you pay back that loan. And you're borrowing from foreigners using currencies that they have, not your own currency. So one of the ways to kind of encourage our governments is to borrow more locally. So the Nigerian people themselves should be buying treasury bills from the Nigerian government to lend to its own government, in Nigerian kwacha, denominated in Nigerian kwacha, with much longer time horizons, because we're all Nigerians. We are invested in the future of Nigeria. I'm not a Dutch person who needs to have my return on investment in Nigeria come back to me after 2 years. I can wait for 20 years in Nigeria because I live there, because my family lives there. I will always have a connection to Nigeria. So one of the things, and in echoing an earlier question on what you can do as an individual, buy treasury bills. Try and get a situation where the majority of the debt that your government holds is held by its own national citizens.
Fantastic. Your mention of central bank, I'm very sure we run through the spine of many people listening, because some central banks these days have been acting really wild, trying to initiate some monetary policies that are just unbelievably stupid. But yes, as you say, this is the job of the government to a large extent, but as you also echoed, citizens have their own roles to play as well. So on that note, I really want to say a big thank you on behalf of everybody joining us today, and African Liberty, my colleague Chiamaka, Adinu, and Anoba, Peter, Constantine, Manda. Thank you so much for your expertise and your time and your elaborateness with all this, responses. We enjoyed them, and I only hope that all the questions we are unable to take, that folks will direct them to your mailbox or Twitter handle. And for now, I want to say thank you again, and I'll see each of you on the next edition. Thanks.
Thank you, Ibrahim. Thanks everyone for joining and engaging.